Okay, so picture the scene. You are in The Hague, in the Netherlands. It's gray, it's raining because, let's be honest, it is always raining in The Hague. And you walk into this massive, sterile, glass and steel building.
Right, the International Criminal Court.
Exactly, the ICC. And inside, the air is just heavy. You've got judges in their robes, translators sitting in those little soundproof booths, and just the sheer weight of history bearing down on everyone in the room.
The court of last resort, as they call it.
Yeah, and at the center of this particular storm is a confirmation of charges hearing, and this one is about the Philippines and the war on drugs.
And just to pause there for a second, because the legal terms really do matter here. A confirmation of charges hearing, that isn't the trial itself. It's actually a filter. It's the gateway.
So it's kind of like the bouncer at a club deciding if your case is strong enough to actually get in.
A very, very serious bouncer, yes. The pretrial chamber has to decide if there are substantial grounds to believe that crimes were actually committed. If the prosecution fails right here, there is no trial. Former President Rodrigo Duterte goes home, and the case is closed.
Wow.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
They really are. And what we have for you today in this deep dive is something really special. We aren't just reading, polished news summaries or press releases. We have the actual transcript of the opening statement delivered by Duterte's defense counsel.
Attorney Nicholas Kaufman.
Right, Kaufman.
Yeah.
Plus, we've got some notes on these brief little interjections from a news anchor, the Capuzzo broadcast, analyzing the strategy in real time from the sidelines. It really gives you the vibe in the room.
And Kaufman's job here is, it is monumental. He has to defend a leader who is globally famous for inflammatory rhetoric. We're talking about a man who literally went on television and threatened to kill criminals.
Yeah.
How do you defend that in a court of law?
Well, that is the exact mission for our deep dive today. We are going to unpack the defense's strategy. And let me tell you, it is not what I expected at all.
No, it's quite a ride.
It's part legal technicality, part political thriller, and surprisingly, part biography. And just a quick reminder for you listening, we are just looking at the defense's arguments today. We're not taking sides, just analyzing how this lawyer constructed his case.
Exactly. We're just looking at the mechanics of the argument. And it's a fascinating mix. Kaufman isn't just arguing about the evidence. He is actively trying to reframe the entire narrative of who Rodrigo Duterte actually is.
So let's jump right into that, because the first thing that hit me reading this transcript is that Kaufman, he doesn't start with the law. He doesn't start citing the Rome Statute or jurisdictional precedents.
Right.
He starts with a story about a 5-year-old boy.
Yeah, the Tate Digon narrative. Tate means father in Tagalog. Kaufman knows that before he can defend the actions, he has to completely humanize the man. He needs to strip away that dictator label the prosecution has built up, and he replaces it with something entirely different.
And the picture he paints is really gritty. He talks about Duterte at age 5, living in a shack in Davao. And not just any shack. He specifically mentions that the roof leaked so badly that when it rained, the future president had to literally crawl under the kitchen table just to stay dry.
It's a very specific, very evocative detail, isn't it? It immediately grounds Duterte in poverty. It basically tells the judges, look, this man isn't one of the out-of-touch elites. He knows what it feels like to have the rain falling on his head inside his own home.
And he just keeps hammering this contrast with the elite. He fast forwards to when Duterte is actually president. You'd think, okay, now he's living the high life, right?
I think so.
But Kaufman claims Duterte refused to sleep in the palatial grandeur of the Malacañang Palace.
Right, he specifically mentions the Spartan quarters. Kaufman says Duterte preferred to sleep in his bodyguard's quarters rather than the actual presidential suite.
And the food. This part honestly made me chuckle a bit just because of how specific it was. Kaufman says while the elites were eating imported Australian beef, the president was eating dried fish and boiled rice.
It's the classic simple man defense. Kaufman is building a psychological profile here. He says Duterte's pleasures weren't found on the cocktail party circuit of Forbes Park, which is the super wealthy enclave in Manila, but rather on the back of a motorcycle.
Yes, driving so fast he almost killed himself. That was the exact quote from the transcript.
Exactly. It paints him as maybe a bit reckless, but authentic. A man of action. A guy who prefers the danger of the open road to the safety of a high society gala dinner. But there is a very solid legal reason for this biography, too. It sets up what we can call the Davao model.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because Duterte was mayor of Davao City for a really long time, right?
Yeah. About 2 decades. And Kaufman's central argument here is that you cannot possibly understand his presidency without understanding his time as mayor. He argues that Duterte took Davao from being this outpost of communist insurgency, a very, very dangerous place, and completely transformed it.
Into one of the safest cities in the world, according to the defense.
Exactly. So the argument is that he had a proven track record.
But it's more than just a track record, right? The defense's spin is that the Filipino people knew exactly what they were getting. Kaufman says he wasn't elected in spite of his obsession with law and order.
He was elected because of it.
Right. Kaufman frames it as this firm and uncompromising commitment that the voters actually demanded.
Which is a bold subtext. It's basically a direct challenge to the court. He's asking the ICC, are you really going to put a man on trial for doing exactly what millions of his own people hired him to do?
And it's a pretty massive... But the mandate from the voters wasn't to commit crimes against humanity. And this brings us to the actual evidence, because the prosecution definitely has receipts.
Oh, they do. They have the speeches.
The kill speeches. The prosecution relies on roughly 20 speeches where Duterte says things like, kill them, dump them, neutralize them. And honestly, reading those, it seems like an open and shut case of incitement to violence.
It does. But Kaufman flips it entirely.
Oh.
This is his cherry-picking argument. And
Yeah.
this is where we really get into the weeds of his legal strategy. Kaufman outright accuses the prosecution of taking tiny snippets out of context to build a monster.
While ignoring the vast majority of what he actually said, and I absolutely loved the visual Kaufman used here. He talks about his defense team working in this pokey little office at the ICC.
With the ticking counter.
Yes, a mechanical clicker. He says they sat there going through mountains of transcripts, and every single time they found a speech where Duterte mentioned due process or the rule of law or self-defense, click.
It creates such a great image of defense diligence versus the prosecution's supposed laziness. Kaufman claims that for every single speech the prosecution found urging violence, his team found many, many more urging restraint.
Yeah, the math he threw out was that they had 350% more speeches favoring the defense, which sounds super impressive. But quality matters a lot more than quantity in a court of law, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can tell your police to follow the law 1,000 times, but if you explicitly order a murder once, that one time is what you're on trial for. So Kaufman knows he has to do a lot more than just count speeches. He has to explain away the bad ones.
And he uses the Pietà speech as his prime example of this.
Right.
Okay, so this was the part of the transcript where I really had to sit up and pay attention, because the prosecution's quote from the speech is objectively terrifying. They quote Duterte saying, if you don't want to die, don't rely on the priests.
Taken completely alone, that sounds like a direct, undeniable threat to anyone seeking sanctuary. It sounds like he's saying the church cannot save you from me.
Exactly. But then Kaufman reads the rest of the paragraph in court.
Right. He just goes a few lines down in the exact same transcript, and he quotes Duterte addressing the police directly. He says, abuse your authority, and there will be hell to pay, for you will have become worse than criminality itself.
That really changes the vibe of the speech.
It creates a massive contradiction for the prosecution.
Yeah.
Kaufman is looking at the judges and asking, how can you possibly call this a clear order to commit mass murder, when, in the very next breath, he is threatening to fiercely punish any police officer who abuses their power?
So what is the defense's ultimate explanation for the violent words then? If he didn't mean kill, why did he repeatedly say kill?
Kaufman dismisses it as street language. He argues it was purely metaphorical. He says words like neutralize or kill were a tactic used to instill fear in criminal elements, basically psychological warfare, but they were never intended as actual tactical orders for the police to go execute people without a trial.
So he's saying it was all bluster, it was just the Tate Digong persona barking loudly to keep the wolves away from the door?
Precisely. He argues the prosecution is taking a populist politician's hyperbole and treating it like a military general's operational command.
Okay, so we've got the simple man defense, and we have the bad translation or out-of-context defense, but then the transcript just takes a wild turn. We completely leave the standard legal arguments and enter what honestly felt like the season finale of a political thriller.
The political betrayal angle.
Yeah.
This is where Kaufman really takes the gloves off.
He goes directly after the current Philippine administration. And for you listening who might not follow Philippine politics super closely, the current president is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., often called BBM. And historically, the Marcos and Duterte families were massive political allies.
Right. Sarah Duterte is the vice president right now. They ran together on a unity ticket. But Kaufman just blows that unity narrative completely apart in this courtroom. He flat out alleges that this entire ICC process has been unconstitutionally hijacked by the current government.
To eliminate a political rival. He draws this incredibly sharp contrast between the two leaders. He says of Duterte, his word was his word. But of President Marcos, he says his word is for the wind.
Which is a scathing insult in diplomatic and legal terms. And he backs it up with a very specific, very explosive allegation regarding the ICC. Kaufman claims that BBM gave a cast iron, undertaking a solemn, unbreakable promise that his government would not assist the ICC investigation in any way.
Because the Philippines officially withdrew from the Rome Statute. Right.
Yeah.
So the promise was basically, we are out of the ICC and we are not helping you investigate our people.
But Kaufman claims that promise was a complete lie. He argues the current administration is secretly funneling witnesses and evidence to The Hague, all while publicly pretending to resist the court's jurisdiction.
And this is where the covert recording comes in. This detail was just wild. Kaufman tells the court that the defense received a document just 1 week before this hearing.
Talk about a last-minute plot twist.
Seriously. He says it's a transcript of a covertly recorded call involving a silent partner of President Marcos. And this silent partner is allegedly on tape bragging about managing the scheme to send witnesses to the ICC while ensuring the president maintains, and this is the crucial phrase, plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability. It really does sound like something out of a spy novel.
It does, but legally speaking, it's an incredibly powerful argument to make.
Right.
Kaufman is essentially telling the judges, you think you are sitting here adjudicating justice. No, you are being used as a blunt tool in a domestic political purge.
Exactly. He's saying these witnesses aren't here to tell the truth. They are here because the current president wants the former president neutralized.
He literally uses that word, doesn't he? He says the motive is to neutralize Duterte and his legacy.
He takes the prosecution's favorite word from the speeches and turns it right back against them. It's very clever rhetoric. And if the judges buy this narrative, then the entire case starts to look like a partisan hit job.
Which casts a huge shadow over the credibility of every single witness. If the witnesses are part of a covert political operation, how can the court trust anything they say?
Exactly. But Kaufman knows he can't just stop there. He has to address the victims. Because the core accusation driving this whole thing is that the war on drugs was actually a war on the poor.
Right.
The narrative is that the police kicked down doors in the slums and shot people in flip-flops, while the wealthy drug lords in their mansions were left completely alone.
And that is a very widely held view in the international community. So Kaufman has to dismantle it. And he does it by going back to that logical inconsistency argument we saw earlier.
Yes, he asks the court, why would a man who lived a frugal life remember the dried fish wage a war on the very people he lived among and championed?
But he goes way beyond just the lifestyle argument. He starts listing actual tangible policies. And I think this is important because it moves the defense from just vibes to hard legislative facts. He mentions the 2017 tax reform that drastically reduced income tax for lower earners.
Right. And he heavily leans on the 4Ps program, which is a massive conditional cash transfer program directly for the poorest families in the country.
He also mentions universal health care and the Magna Carta of the poor.
Exactly. His argument is, look at the actual legislative record of this man. This administration passed massive, historic social safety nets. Kaufman asks the court, does it make any logical sense at all that a president would pass complex laws to feed, heal, and financially support the poor and simultaneously launch a street-level campaign to exterminate them?
He's reframing the drug war. He's saying it wasn't an attack on the poor, but rather a harsh, necessary evil to protect the poor.
That's his angle. He argues that the drug trade always destroys the most vulnerable communities first. So from the defense's perspective, eradicating the drugs is the ultimate pro-poor policy.
And then he completely zooms out. He brings the geopolitics into the courtroom. He calls the Philippines a transit hub for massive Chinese narcotics cartels.
This is to show the sheer scale of the problem Duterte was facing. He's telling the judges this wasn't just a few street dealers causing trouble. This was a literal invasion by heavily armed international syndicates.
Yeah.
And then he uses a classic whataboutism, but honestly, a legally relevant one. He points directly to Latin America.
He says the death rates in 3 specific Latin American countries are significantly higher than they ever were in the Philippines under Duterte.
And he asks a very pointed question. where is the ICC? If this court is truly about saving lives and stopping violence, why are they obsessively focusing on Duterte and ignoring much worse violence elsewhere? He's accusing the prosecutor of selective prosecution.
And he threw out a statistic here that really surprised me. He claims that after Duterte left office, narcotics-related crime death rates actually increased.
That is a critical data point for the defense.
Right.
He's asking the chamber, if Duterte was the evil mastermind personally ordering all these killings, why did the killings continue or even get worse after he stepped down?
So if the violence continued without him, it suggests the violence is systemic to the drug trade itself.
Exactly. Not the result of one man's orders. You can't pin systemic cartel violence on a retired president.
Man, Kaufman really covers all the bases. He's defended the man's character, he's attacked the specific evidence, exposed the alleged political plot, and reframed the entire domestic policy. But there is one group left he still needs to discredit.
The storytellers.
Right, the people who told the world that this was a war on the poor in the first place.
The civil society. The NGOs, the human rights groups, the international media. Kaufman goes after them with a sledgehammer.
He outright claims they are funded by partisan tycoons with a specific agenda to ruin Duterte. But what really stood out to me was how he openly mocked their reports. He read out the titles of these human rights reports like he was reviewing bad action movies.
License to kill. One shot to the head. You can die anytime.
They just kill.
Yes. Kaufman is mocking the blatant sensationalism of it all. He talks about these glossy reports with neon-lit crime scenes.
Neon lit. That is such a specific cutting criticism. He's implying they literally set up the lighting at crime scenes to make the photos look more dramatic.
He's heavily implying that the entire narrative was crafted for shock value, for internet clicks, and to win international journalism awards, rather than to provide actual, admissible legal truth. He basically says these journalists and activists won their Nobel Prizes for creating a story that became sacred.
Wow.
But he reminds the judges that a sacred popular story is not the same thing as hard evidence in a court of law.
And he doesn't just attack the NGOs. He goes right to the top and attacks the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC himself, Karim Khan.
This is a procedural attack, but a remarkably serious one. Kaufman points out to the chamber that before Karim Khan became the Chief Prosecutor, he worked as a private lawyer. And specifically, he worked representing victims in this exact Philippine situation.
Kaufman claims Khan interviewed a key witness referred to as P1 way back in 2018, right?
Correct. And the defense argues this is a massive disqualifying conflict of interest. They ask, how can you possibly be the neutral, objective prosecutor investigating a case if you previously acted as a paid lawyer for the accusers in that very same context?
Kaufman actually calls it a one-track crusade.
He does. He says the entire ICC investigation was contaminated from day one because the guy in charge already had a predetermined objective before he even took the job.
It's essentially a fruit of the poisonous tree argument. If the prosecutor is biased from the start, then the investigation is biased, the witness selection is biased, and the resulting evidence is biased.
Exactly. It's an attempt to throw out the entire case on a technical procedural ground.
So we've reached the end of this incredibly dense opening statement. Kaufman has scorched the earth. He's attacked the politicians, the media, the evidence, and the prosecutor. How does he finally land the plane? Does he quote some grand piece of international law?
No. And honestly, this is so consistent with his entire strategy. He doesn't end on a dry legal note. He circles right back to where he started. Back to the emotion, back to the man.
He just asks the judges to send Duterte home.
He makes a very simple final appeal to the chamber. He asks them to return Tate Digong to his family and to the Filipino people.
He uses that specific name again, Tate Digong.
It's the ultimate branding exercise. Kaufman wants the very last image in the judges' minds to be the father, not the punisher. He wants them to look at an 80-year-old retired statesman who served his country in a tough environment, not some cartoonish criminal mastermind.
It really is incredible to see it all laid out like this. You know, when you just read the headlines, it seems so black and white, Duterte accused of crimes. But when you look at the actual defense strategy, you see these incredibly deep layers of politics, history, personality, and sharp legal technicality all woven together.
It really highlights the sheer complexity of international justice. We like to think of these international courts as clean laboratories where pure truth is distilled. But in reality, They are messy battlegrounds for competing narratives. Kaufman is betting everything that he can convince these judges that the war on drugs was a lawful, necessary state response to a crisis.
And that the crimes against humanity charge is just a fiction created by political enemies and greedy NGOs.
Exactly. And frankly, whether you believe Kaufman's narrative or not, the strategy itself is undeniably impressive in its scope.
It really is. And it leaves us with a very provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up.
What's that?
Well, Kaufman's defense relies so heavily on the idea that Duterte's violent language was just theater, a blunt tool used to instill fear without necessarily ordering specific crimes.
Right, the bluster argument.
So here's the question for you listening to think about. If a leader uses highly violent language that undeniably creates an atmosphere of fear and permissiveness, but they privately technically warn the police against abuse, where does the legal line regarding incitement actually fall?
That is the tricky part of international law. Can you be held criminally responsible for the chaos you unleash with a microphone, even if you technically covered your tracks in the fine print? And perhaps even more uncomfortably,
Yeah.
how much does the timing of this international justice depend on who happens to be sitting in the presidential palace right now?
Yeah.
Think about it. If Duterte were still in power, or if you were still tight allies with the Marcos family, would we be seeing these covert recordings leaked? Would we be talking about broken promises to the ICC?
That is a really heavy question. Is this pure justice, or is it just the newest weapon in the next round of domestic politics?
That is exactly what the judges in The Hague have to decide.
Well, a huge thank you to you, our listener, for tuning in to this deep dive. We hope this gave you a real front row seat to the drama unfolding at the ICC.
It's a rapidly developing story, and definitely a one worth watching closely.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep asking the hard questions.